The sound of artillery never really stopped on the Western Front. It rolled through the air like distant thunder, shaking the ground and rattling the nerves of every man who waited in the mud for what would come next. Smoke hung low over the battlefield, mixing with the smell of oil, burning metal, and blood. This was not a place meant for mercy. It was designed for destruction. And yet, in the middle of this chaos, one man would make a decision so unexpected that it would turn a weapon of war into a vehicle of survival. He was not a general. He was not a tank commander. He was a medic, trained to save lives, not to fight battles. When the wounded began to pile up, faster than ambulances could reach them, when stretcher bearers were pinned down by machine gun fire, and when retreat meant certain death for those left behind, this medic looked at a Sherman tank and saw something no one else did. He saw an ambulance. The battle had already been raging for hours. Infantry units were advancing yard by yard, paying for every step with blood. Enemy fire cut through open fields, making movement almost impossible. The wounded lay scattered across shell craters, ditches, and broken ground, calling out for help that could not easily reach them. Standard medical evacuation routes were gone. Jeeps had been destroyed. Dedicated ambulances were either too far back or already overwhelmed. Every minute mattered, because in combat medicine, time was the difference between life and death. The medic moved from man to man, applying tourniquets, injecting morphine, whispering words of reassurance. He was not sure he believed himself. He knew the truth. If these men did not get out soon, many of them would not survive the night. As he crawled through the dirt under fire, the medic noticed the Sherman tank idling nearby. Its engine roared, its armor scarred from earlier hits. Its gun still pointing toward the enemy. The tank crew was waiting for orders, ready to push forward again. To most soldiers, the Sherman was a symbol of power and aggression. To the enemy, it was a target. To this medic, in that moment, it became something else entirely. He realized that the thick steel armor that protected the crew from bullets and shrapnel could also protect wounded men. The tank could move where wheeled vehicles could not. It could cross open ground under fire. It could reach places no ambulance would dare to go. The idea was risky, unconventional, and possibly against regulations. But regulations meant nothing compared to the lives bleeding out on the ground. He approached the tank commander and shouted over the engine noise and incoming fire. At first, the crew thought he was out of his mind. A tank was not built to carry casualties. There was barely room inside for the crew, ammunition, and equipment. Opening the tank to load wounded men would expose everyone to danger. But the medic did not back down. He pointed toward the field, toward the men lying helpless, and made his case with urgency and raw emotion. There was no other option. Either they tried something new, or they watched soldiers die where they fell. Reluctantly, the tank commander agreed. They would try it once. If it worked, they would keep going. If it failed, at least they would know they had done everything possible. The first wounded soldier was dragged toward the tank under fire. The medic and infantrymen worked together, lifting him as carefully as they could. Blood soaked through his uniform. His breathing was shallow. Every second felt heavy with danger. The tank hatch opened briefly, just long enough to pull the man inside. The steel door slammed shut, and the engine revved. The Sherman moved forward, not toward the enemy, but away from the front line, carrying its human cargo to safety. When the tank returned, something had changed. Word spread quickly. among the soldiers. A tank was evacuating wounded. What sounded impossible only minutes earlier was now real. Men who had lost hope suddenly believed they might survive. The medic did not waste time. He organized the wounded, prioritizing those who could not wait. He marked positions, coordinated with infantry units, and kept moving despite exhaustion. Each trip the tank made was dangerous. Enemy gunners quickly noticed the unusual movement. Shells exploded nearby. Bullets pinged off the armor, but the tank kept coming back. Inside the Sherman, conditions were brutal. The wounded were packed tightly, lying on the floor or leaning against the walls. The noise was deafening. The air was thick with fumes and the metallic smell of blood. There were no stretchers, no comfort, only the knowledge that they were no longer exposed to the open battlefield. The medic rode with them when he could, stabilizing wounds, checking pulses, holding hands when fear threatened to overwhelm pain. He spoke calmly, even when his own heart raced. He understood something deeply in those moments. Courage was not the absence of fear. It was acting despite it. Trip after trip, the numbers grew. 10 wounded, 20, 30. Each evacuation brought new challenges. Sometimes the tank had to stop because the terrain was impassable. Sometimes it had to wait because enemy fire intensified. Each delay cost precious minutes. The medic adapted constantly, adjusting his methods, learning how to load casualties faster, how to communicate with the tank crew more efficiently, how to move wounded men without worsening their injuries. There was no manual for this. He was inventing a new kind of battlefield evacuation in real time. As the day wore on, exhaustion took its toll. The medic's hands trembled as he worked. His uniform was stained dark with blood that was not his own. He had not eaten. He had barely slept in days. But every time he considered stopping, another cry for help reached his ears. Another man needed him. The battlefield did not care about limits, and neither could he. The Sherman tank became a lifeline, moving back and forth like a steel heartbeat, pumping wounded soldiers out of the killing zone and into a chance at survival. By nightfall, the count approached numbers no one would have believed possible. Nearly 100 wounded soldiers had been evacuated using a tank never meant for mercy. Officers took notice. Some were stunned. Others were uneasy, aware that what was happening broke traditional rules of warfare. But no one could argue with the results. Lives had been saved. Men who would have died in the mud were now receiving proper medical care. The medic, however, did not see himself as a hero. To him, this was simply what needed to be done. As darkness fell, the battlefield quieted slightly, though the danger never disappeared completely. The Sherman finally halted, its engine cooling, its crew drained. The medic sat on the ground, his back against the steel hull, too tired to speak. Around him, soldiers moved with a new sense of respect. They had witnessed something rare, not just bravery, but creativity under fire, compassion in a place designed to crush it. This was only the beginning of the story, because the impact of that decision would echo far beyond that single battlefield. What started as a desperate improvisation would become one of the most extraordinary acts of medical courage in World War II. The night did not bring peace, only a different kind of tension. The battlefield was quieter, but the silence felt heavy, broken at random by distant explosions and the groans of men still waiting to be found. The medic forced himself back to his feet even though every muscle protested. He knew there were more wounded out there, Darkness made everything harder. Visibility dropped to almost nothing, and the risk of enemy ambush increased with every step. Yet the Sherman tank remained nearby, its presence a strange comfort. The crew had rested only briefly before agreeing to continue. They understood now what this machine had become. It was no longer just armor and firepower. It was a moving shelter, a promise that someone had not been forgotten. The medic reorganized his approach. During daylight, speed had been the priority. At night, precision mattered more. He moved carefully, guided by faint cries, reflective markings, and the memory of where units had advanced earlier. Each wounded soldier told a different story through their injuries. Shrapnel wounds, gunshots, blast trauma, burns. The medic worked methodically, assessing who could survive transport and who needed immediate intervention on the spot. His training took over. Even as fatigue threatened his focus, he spoke softly, identifying himself, letting the wounded know they were not alone. In war, those words carried more weight than any medal. The Sherman advanced slowly, using minimal light to avoid detection. Each time the hatch opened, it felt like an eternity. The medic coordinated silently with the crew, using hand signals and short commands. The enemy had begun to notice the pattern. This tank was not behaving like others. It moved back and forth, away from combat, returning repeatedly. Suspicion grew. Incoming fire increased near evacuation points. Once, a shell exploded close enough to knock the medic to the ground. Dirt filled his mouth. His ears rang. For a moment, everything went white. When his vision returned, he was still alive. So were the wounded beside him. He stood up and kept working. Inside the tank, conditions worsened. Space ran out quickly. The crew had removed non-essential equipment to make room. Ammunition was shifted. Personal gear was pushed aside. Wounded men lay on top of metal surfaces never meant for human bodies. The tank vibrated constantly, sending pain through broken bones and torn flesh. The medic did what he could, cushioning limbs, checking bleeding, reminding the men to breathe slowly. Some cried, some prayed, some stared silently, their eyes fixed on nothing. He treated them all the same, because in that steel box, rank and background disappeared. There were only lives to be saved. At the field hospital behind the lines, disbelief spread. Doctors and nurses watched as a tank rolled in and began unloading wounded men. At first, they thought it was a mistake. Then they saw the volume. One after another, soldiers were carried out, stabilized just enough to survive the journey. The medical staff worked frantically, adjusting to the unexpected influx. The medic stayed only long enough to give quick reports before climbing back onto the tank for another run. He refused rest. He refused food. There would be time for that later, if later came. The evacuation continued into the early hours of morning. The count climbed higher. Each successful trip reinforced the belief that this insane idea was working. Other units began requesting similar help, but resources were limited. There was only one tank available for this role, and it was already being pushed beyond anything it was designed for. The medic faced impossible choices. Who went first? Who could wait? Who might not make it, no matter what he did? These decisions haunted him, even as he made them quickly. There was no room for hesitation. At one point, the tank became temporarily immobilized, its tracks damaged by debris. Enemy fire intensified immediately. The medic and crew were trapped, surrounded by wounded men inside the tank and more outside waiting for help. Panic threatened to take over, but training and trust held them together. The crew worked under fire to repair the damage. The medic stayed exposed longer than he should have, shielding a wounded soldier with his own body while applying pressure to a bleeding wound. Bullets struck the armor inches away. The sound was terrifying, sharp and metallic. When the track finally engaged again and the tank lurched forward, everyone inside knew they had just escaped death by seconds. Dawn approached slowly, bringing with it a thin gray light. The battlefield revealed its full cost. The medic paused briefly, standing on a small rise. Looking out over the ground they had covered, bodies lay still. Equipment was scattered everywhere. The air smelled of smoke and damp earth. He felt a weight settle on his chest. Not fear, but something heavier. Grief mixed with determination. He could not save everyone, but he had saved many, and that mattered. As the sun rose, higher command became aware of what had happened. Reports filtered upward about a medic using a Sherman tank as an improvised ambulance, evacuating numbers far beyond expectation. Reactions varied. Some officers praised the initiative. Others worried about setting a dangerous precedent. Tanks were valuable assets, not to be risked on medical evacuation. But the facts were undeniable. Nearly 100 wounded soldiers were alive because of this decision. Arguments felt small compared to that reality. The medic was finally ordered to stand down later that day. His hands were swollen, his eyes burned. He could barely stand without support. When he tried to protest, insisting there might be more wounded, his voice cracked from exhaustion. He was guided away, given water, and forced to rest. Only then did the adrenaline fade, replaced by shaking and an overwhelming sense of emptiness. He had been running on pure will for too long. As he lay on a stretcher himself, not wounded, but depleted, he replayed the events in his mind. The first moment, he saw the tank differently. The fear in the eyes of the wounded as they were lifted inside. The sound of rounds hitting steel. The relief when they reached safety. He did not think of himself as brave. He thought of himself as lucky. Lucky to have fought differently. Lucky the crew had trusted him. Lucky the tank had held together long enough. Word of the evacuation spread among the soldiers. The medic's name passed quietly from unit to unit, spoken with respect. For many, he became a symbol of something rare in war, proof that even in the darkest moments, humanity could assert itself. The Sherman tank, once just another machine of destruction, had become part of that story. Its scars told a new kind of history, one written not in enemy casualties, but in lives saved. This was not the end of the medic's journey. The physical battle had paused, but the emotional weight would follow him long after the guns fell silent. What he had done would challenge assumptions about warfare, about roles, about what was possible under fire. The consequences of that decision would unfold slowly, shaping how people remembered that battle and the quiet heroism that took place within it. And as the war continued to rage across continents, the story of a medic and a Sherman tank would remain a powerful reminder that courage sometimes means rewriting the rules when lives are on the line. When the medic finally returned to duty days later, the battlefield he stepped into felt different. Even though the war itself had not changed, the ground was still torn apart. The air still carried the distant echo of gunfire, and men were still being wounded and killed every hour. But something subtle had shifted. Soldiers looked at him differently, not with celebration or loud praise, but with quiet recognition. Many of the men walking past him were alive because of what he had done. Some limped, some carried bandages, some simply nodded, unable to find words. That silent acknowledgement weighed heavier than any formal commendation ever could. Official reports were written in clean, controlled language that could never fully capture what had happened. They spoke of improvised evacuation, exceptional initiative, and extraordinary results. Numbers were listed. Nearly 100 wounded evacuated, 0 fatalities during transport, minimal damage to armored assets. On paper, it looked almost simple, but the medic knew how close it had come to failure at every stage. How one broken track, one accurate enemy shell, or one moment of hesitation could have turned that Sherman into a metal coffin. The reality lived in his memory, vivid and unfiltered. Higher command debated the incident intensely. Some saw it as a one-time miracle, not to be repeated. Others saw potential. The idea that armored vehicles could be used, even temporarily, for casualty evacuation in extreme conditions challenged long-held doctrines. War had always separated roles clearly. Tanks fought. Medics healed. Lines were not meant to blur. But the battlefield had forced those lines to disappear, and the results could not be ignored. Quietly, without announcements, lessons were learned. Training manuals would not change overnight, but minds had been opened. The medic himself did not seek attention. When questioned, he gave straightforward answers. He explained the conditions, the lack of options, the urgency. He never described it as bravery. To him, bravery implied choice. What he felt he had experienced was necessity. When the system failed under pressure, someone had to adapt. That was all. Still, officers listening could hear something deeper in his voice. A conviction rooted in the belief that human life outweighed equipment, doctrine, and personal safety. The Sherman tank that had served as an ambulance did not return immediately to frontline combat. Mechanics inspected it carefully. Its armor bore fresh scars. Its interior showed signs of its unusual mission. Bloodstains remained, despite cleaning, absorbed into corners and seams. For the crew, climbing back inside felt strange. That steel space was no longer just a weapon. It was a place where lives had hung in the balance, where fear and hope had existed side by side. Every time the engine started, they remembered the wounded men packed inside, the medic's calm voice cutting through the noise. As the war pushed forward, the medic continued his work. He treated wounds, evacuated casualties, and faced the same dangers as before. But something inside him had changed permanently. He had seen what was possible when rigid thinking broke under pressure. He trusted his instincts more. He questioned assumptions more often. He became known as someone who found solutions where none seemed to exist. That reputation followed him, not as a hero, but as a problem solver in the worst conditions imaginable. Letters began to arrive from families back home. Mothers, wives, fathers, and siblings wrote to thank an unnamed medic who had helped save someone they loved. Some letters reached him directly. Others were shared through the unit. He read them quietly, usually alone. He never responded, because he did not know what to say. How could he explain that he remembered faces, but not names, voices, but not details, moments, but not timelines? He carried all of them with him, an invisible weight that grew heavier with each passing month. When the war finally ended, celebrations erupted across continents. Flags waved, crowds cheered, soldiers hugged each other, relieved to have survived. The medic felt relief too, but also confusion. Peace felt unreal after years of constant urgency. For a long time, he still woke up, expecting artillery, expecting cries for help. The habits of survival did not fade easily. He returned home, changed, in ways that were difficult to explain to anyone who had not been there. For years, the story of the Sherman tank ambulance remained largely unknown. It did not fit neatly into popular war narratives. It was not a famous battle maneuver or a decisive victory. It was an act of compassion hidden within chaos. History often favors grand strategies and famous names, leaving quieter acts to fade into the background. The medic did not push to change that. He built a life, carried memories, and avoided the spotlight. Only much later did historians begin to uncover stories like his. As personal accounts surfaced and archives opened, researchers found references to an unusual evacuation during a critical battle. They traced reports, compared testimonies, and slowly reconstructed what had happened. The numbers stood out. The methods stood out even more. A tank used not to advance a front line, but to preserve life. Scholars recognized it as an example of adaptive thinking under extreme stress. A reminder that innovation in war is not always about better weapons, but about better ways to protect those caught in its path. Veterans who had been there spoke about it with emotion. Some admitted that seeing wounded men loaded into a tank had restored their faith in something they thought they had lost. Others said it reminded them why they were fighting in the first place. Not for glory, but for each other. The medic's actions had rippled outward, influencing morale in ways no official order ever could. Today, when people study World War II, they often focus on numbers, dates, and outcomes. But stories like this reveal the human layer beneath those facts. They show how individuals, faced with impossible choices, can redefine what is acceptable and what is possible. The medic did not change the course of the war. He did something arguably more important. He changed the course of nearly 100 lives, and through them, the lives of countless others. The image of a Sherman tank rolling away from the front lines, carrying wounded men instead of ammunition, remains powerful because it contradicts expectations. It reminds us that even the most destructive tools can be repurposed for good when guided by courage and empathy. In a conflict defined by brutality, that contrast stands out sharply. The medic's legacy does not live in statues or famous speeches. It lives in the quiet moments of survival, in families that were not left without sons, in children who grew up because a father came home, in the unrecorded conversations of veterans who remembered a tank not as a machine of death, but as the reason they lived to remember anything at all. This story endures because it speaks to something universal. When systems collapse and rules no longer serve reality, humanity still has a choice: to follow orders blindly or to act with conscience. On that battlefield, amid smoke and fear, one medic chose to see possibility where others saw only steel. He chose to turn a weapon into a refuge, and in doing so, he left behind a lesson far more lasting than any victory map. Even in the darkest hours of war, saving a single life can become an act that defines history.